Ladies and gentlemen, my name is John McKeown, and I'm the Vice Chairman of the Anglo-Omani Society. And my task is to welcome you to our premises, and we hope that you have a very good conference. It gives me particular pleasure to welcome you to this conference because I started my working life as an evening newspaper reporter in Manchester, and then I became sub-editor of the Western Morning News, a morning newspaper in Britain. I was in our reserve army and then joined the regular army for 3 years, but accidentally stayed for 30 years. And so did not go back to journalism, except that I edit the Anglo-Omani Review, and I hope you'll take a copy with you when you leave. My connection with Oman began when I served with the Sultan's armed forces during the Dhofar War. The Anglo-Omani Society, because of the long association of and friendship between Britons and Omanis, began a little over 40 years ago. And it composes people who served there as diplomats, as commercial people, as soldiers. It's probably the most active organization of its kind in London, and we're very proud of that. These premises were endowed by His Majesty, both as a place to meet and as a source of revenue, and we use our rents to fund all kinds of activities in and concerning the Sultanate. You are particularly warmly welcomed, and I'm about to hand over to the panel with a final welcome. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. أهلا وسهلا فيكم جميعا. My name is Wissam Saigh. I'm a London-based journalist, media trainer and consultant, and I will be facilitating this session of questions and answers tonight. First, let me introduce you to our panelists. Zahira Harb is a senior lecturer in international journalism at City University of London. She is the author of 3 books focusing on media, journalism, and politics in the Middle East. She is board member, trustee of the Ethical Journalism Network, and has served as board member of the UK broadcast regulator Ofcom's content board for 3 years, from 2015 to 2018. Zahira also is the co-editor of Middle East Journal of Cultural and Communication and associate editor of Journalism Practice. Zahira was a TV reporter for international outlets, organizations, and she used to produce and present news in her native country, Lebanon. Thank you for joining us, Zahira.
Thank you.
Chris Brickett. Chris is a former senior executive at Sky News, BBC News, and the Telegraph Media Group. Now he's a media consultant. He has worked at the front line of rolling news for UK's largest news organizations for more than 3 decades. Also, Chris is an Emmy Award winner in 2007 for leading Sky News coverage of the London terror attacks, and a Royal Television Society Award in 2010 for his part in negotiating the UK's first ever prime ministerial debates. Thank you for joining us. Nigel Baker has been a UK journalist for 45 years, working in commercial TV, radio, and news agencies. He is chief executive of the Thomson Foundation and chairman of the Sky News editorial board. He was previously a vice president at the Associated Press, and he held senior roles in Reuters, UK news broadcaster Sky News, and ITN. Our main topic tonight will be UK editorial reality and what pressures shape the editorial decision-making in UK outlets, starting from tabloids, private-owned outlets, and the BBC. Chris, would you like to start talking about the pressures that shape editorial decisions in the UK?
I certainly will. Is that on? Can everyone hear me? Good. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was reflecting on this question from when I began in journalism in 1985 as a young producer on radio current affairs at the BBC, and I was trying to think, well, what pressures did we have on us then? And it was very, very different actually, and remarkably limited. We had fearsome editors who would shout at us. Editors don't shout quite as much these days as they used to, for various cultural reasons, I guess. But we were shouted at a lot, and that was a big pressure. We had the pressure of deadlines, but they were few and far between. I had 2 deadlines in a day when I was a radio producer, one at 1 o'clock for a BBC programme called The World at 1, and one at 5 o'clock for a BBC programme called PM. And that meant that we spent a lot of time over lunch in various parts of London around Broadcasting House, which I would like to take you to. So life was very different. We used to get, someone was once sent on a story to Portsmouth, which I don't know if you know is on the south coast. It's a sort of, it's a town, a naval town. It's where HMS Victory, the oldest ship in the British Navy, is still stationed. And they decided they'd go there by taking a taxi. This was in 1986. They took a taxi to Portsmouth, and it cost about £300 in 1986. So one of the pressures that wasn't there in those days was money, and I'll come on to that in a second. And but what we did also have pressure from is we did have sort of pressure from the government. We used to have people ringing us up. We were a very political-based programme, and government department, we used to interview a lot of ministers, and government departments would ring up and complain about the tone of an interview or whether or not a particular question had been fairly framed. So there was a bit of pressure about that, and there was also occasionally a bit of pressure about why we weren't or were doing stories. But it was fairly rare. It happened, but I wouldn't say it happened very often. So if we roll forward almost 4 decades and look at life for a young journalist now, starting in the profession in a similar way that I did, there are a couple of things that I think really stand out for me. I'm not saying these are the only differences, but the reality for a young a young journalist, actually a young journalist, news journalist generally now, is that if you only had 2 deadlines in a day, you'd be very, very happy. You're on a permanent deadline, a rolling deadline, rolling news, digital. There's a deadline the whole time. An old colleague of mine at the BBC, Nick Gowing, used to talk about the news vacuum, which was the bit of time between an event happening and you having to report it. And in that time, speculation could go on, but you didn't actually take part in that speculation as a journalist. Now that vacuum no longer exists. An event happens and you report it straight away, and you find yourself taking part, inevitably, in the speculation that takes place around a particular event. So I think that's one. The no news vacuum, I think, is one of the big differences. The second difference I'd briefly like to mention is in terms, so deadline and no news vacuum. The second difference I'd like to mention is in terms of resources. Journalism commercially is under threat. News journalism commercially is under threat. It's regarded by people who consume it as a free product that they can access easily online on their phones, and therefore they don't see why they should pay for it. This is disrupting the business models for just about every news organisation, apart from those that find funds from oligarchs or governments and such places like that. So if you're working for an organisation that is scared of resources, that means that the amount of stories you have to do is likely to increase, and the amount of time you can spend on checking and getting context for your stories is much less. So I think that's changed a lot. If you were a Daily Telegraph reporter 30 years ago, you'd have 1 deadline a day, you'd write your story for it. Now you're constantly writing for the website, and they haven't increased the number of staff to do it. We were at the Telegraph yesterday. They said they'd halved their staff in the Middle East in the last few years. So that's the commercial pressures make it very different. And then the third pressure that I'd like to say that makes it very different is social media. And the problem with social media, as I see it for journalists, is that it makes the public's reaction to whatever you write or produce instant and very public, and inevitably exerts a pressure on the producer of that content. Because of social media, BBC reporters in particular the reporters that strive to give some sort of impartiality, are bombarded with criticism that they are not impartial, that they get criticism from both sides. And social media is so strong that within hours of a BBC reporter doing a story, social media is powerful enough to get a group of people to march on Broadcasting House in protest against the BBC political correspondent. So you can see the sort of impact that social media has simply on the working life of a journalist. I think they're afraid, and not afraid, it's a pressure to call things as they are for fear of the sort of backlash, the trolling as you call it, online, which didn't exist. If I did something wrong in the BBC in 1985, someone would write to the BBC Complaints Department. If I did something wrong at Sky, and I wouldn't hear about it for weeks. If I did something wrong at Sky News, someone might write to Ofcom, and I wouldn't hear about it for months. If I do an opinion that someone likes now, I'm instantly criticised for it. And I think that's a huge pressure now for journalists. And I think journalists both mentally, and you may know more about this than I do, are feeling that sort of pressure as they work. So that's the three things I'd really like to say that have changed in my career.
Thank you, Chris. So Chris, you mentioned that three different types of pressure. I'll start from the end: social media pressure and the pressure to call things what they are, the resources and access and no deadline pressures. Maybe Zahira, would you like to elaborate if there is any other types of pressure, maybe political or commercial?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me here. And before I start, I was just told that it's the Omani Women's Day, so I would like to greet you, tahiyya, on your day. And I'm happy that we have women taking part in today's session. I'm just going to, pick up on what Chris was saying. I don't have any direct experience with British journalism or British newsrooms. The only experience I had is that I was a BBC Arabic correspondent in Beirut during the 90s. So my role here is someone who has been working in organizations that has to do with British journalism. Part of it is a monitoring type of role, including sitting on the content board of the broadcast regulator in the UK. But I'm going to pick on what, just follow up on what Chris was saying in relation to pressures that journalists in the UK actually say that they go through. What Chris said matches completely a study that was published by Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in 2016, which it's part of a survey that was part of a study called The World of Journalisms in 18 different countries, including the UK. And the survey in the UK actually surveyed 700 journalists, and they said the same thing that Chris said. So basically, the outcome of the research was that the British journalists don't feel that they are under political pressure. So this is the least interference in their editorial work comes from politicians or politics. They also undermined the role of businesses in influencing their editorial practice, basically. They put lots of emphasis on ethics, values, and on regulations and laws, okay? Which is it's a reality. Okay, so you have to differentiate. In the UK, you have the press, the print journalism, which is not actually it's self-regulated. Okay, so there's no kind of like statutory regulation, and the broadcast sector in the UK is statutory regulated and by an organization called Office of Communication, Ofcom, that was established in 2003. So if you're a broadcast journalist, you really need to be careful, because any complaint that goes to Ofcom against your work will have consequences, including it gets to the point where, and it happened with organizations that are not actually British. So for instance, the Iranian TV, Press TV, was, their license to operate in the UK was cancelled because they breached Ofcom broadcast code several times. UK organizations will get to the point where they might actually end up paying a big sum of money if they breach the code several times, and they might get to the point where their license might be suspended for a period of time, and Ofcom has the right to withdraw licenses from those broadcasters. All of these things put pressure on journalists, because they really need to make sure that they are abiding by regulations, and for print journalists to a lesser extent abide by the ethical codes that is put by press associations, and nowadays we have IPSO, which is again a self-regulatory organization. However, what the journalists actually, when they come out and say that, oh, we don't have political pressure, we don't have pressure from businesses, and they also said that they don't, or they have really little pressure from owners, they don't realize that, or that's what we academics say, that there are underpinning pressures that they don't see. Okay? And those underpinning pressures come across when they tell you in the study that they feel that most of the pressure comes from PR companies. And those PR companies might actually be political PR companies that governments hire, companies that also politicians might take advice from. And that type of pressure comes across, but they don't see it directly. And that type of pressure has pressure on journalists in their relationship with sources. And I'll give you one example where it just happened recently. The head of Channel 4 News, Dorothy Byrne, and Current Affairs, Dorothy Byrne, gave a spectacular speech in a Scottish TV festival, in which she actually called Boris Johnson a non-liar. Okay? That had consequences. And the consequences was that Channel 4 was supposed to be scheduled to have an interview with Boris Johnson in the G7 summit. They went to the interview, so Channel 4 News sent a team to do the interview, and access was denied. Okay, so the interview was cancelled. Downing Street didn't say that it's because of what the head of news and Current Affairs said, but in reality, that was a consequence of something that Downing Street felt that they don't actually appreciate. So that type of pressure happens indirectly, without it being known to be a direct political pressure. The other thing that we need to consider in covering international news, and that might be of interest to some of you, is the pressure that comes from political PR companies that actually have a kind of lobbying in pressuring journalists to not cover things the way that they would like it to be covered. Right? And there's so many examples in that context that we can share with you. So I'm going to stop here. I have so much else, but
Yes, I just will summarize quickly in Arabic for those who would like to hear the summary in Arabic. ظاهرة بالإضافة لعملها مع عدد من المؤسسات الإعلامية البريطانية منها البي بي سي، كمان ظاهرة كانت في أوفكوم وهي هيئة رقابة أو مراقبة على وسائل الإعلام المرئية والمسموعة في بريطانيا. وتحدثت زاهرة عن الإحصائية التي شملت 700 صحافي في بريطانيا وهي Word of Journalists، وهذه الإحصائية كانت نتيجة ما قاله هؤلاء الصحفيون، مشابه لما ذكره كريس حول الضغوط التي يتعرضون لها. وكريس يعني للتذكير كان يتحدث عن 3 أنواع من الضغوط، منها وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي، ومنها عدم وجود يعني مهلة للعمل بسبب تواصل العمل، بالإضافة ل اعتقد هذه هي الكوميرشال، الضغوط التجاريه. فالصحفيون تحدثوا في هذه الاحصائيه، تحدثوا عن هذا، ولكن ما تقوله زاهره ان الصحفيين لا يشعرون بالضغط الغير مباشر او بالضغوط غير المباشره التي تقوم بها شركات العلاقات العامه التي تتحدث أو التي تحاول الضغط على هؤلاء الصحفيين، وهي متأثرة بالعوامل السياسية أو بعوامل متعلقة بالسياسات العامة. وأيضا الصحافة المكتوبة تتعرض للضغوط المعايير الأخلاقية للالتزام بمعايير معينة أثناء تغطيتها. ولكن يعني عندما يسألون الصحفيون عما إذا يشعرون بالضغط، فهم عادة يقولون لا، ولكن لا يعرفون أن هناك ضغط غير مباشر يمارس. وعلى سبيل المثال إلغاء مقابلة بوريس جونسون مع شانل 4 بعد تصريحات لرئيسة القناة،
رئيسة مديرة الأخبار والبرامج السياسية،
بقولها أن بوريس جونسون هو معروف بكذبه، فألغيت المقابلة معه في قمة الدول السبع. وهذا نوع من أنواع الضغط الغير مباشر الذي يخضع له الصحفيون. وكذلك في تغطية الأخبار الدولية هناك ضغوط غير مباشرة من قبل هذه شركات العلاقات العامة التي يعني تؤثر بشكل غير مباشر على طريقة التغطية. Thank you, Zahira. Have I missed anything? Nigel.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation to attend this conference. Having heard my 2 colleagues, a lot of what I have to say perhaps echoes the experiences they've had. But I've seen sort of 2 or 3 fundamental changes during my career, and they are to do with what Chris referred to in a sense as the news vacuum, but that is the pressure on journalists to perform at a very high level constantly. If you are a newspaper journalist nowadays, or you're working online, one of my sons happens to be those for a national newspaper, and it's not unusual to turn out sort of 7, 8, 9 stories a day, which doesn't give the chance to dig deep, and quite often you're repurposing other people's material. I think that 2 things that I've seen over the last 40 years during my career, the pressures that changed, was the growth of the spin doctor, which preceded the political PR companies. That started fundamentally in the late 70s, early 80s, under the former Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, and grew ahead of steam under Tony Blair's government, where despite the fact that journalists, as Zahara said, don't feel under direct political pressure, I think it depends on the role of the journalist. I think the average journalist doesn't feel that, but if you are a program editor or a news editor on a national news channel during an election, that pressure can be quite intense, to be it subtle or otherwise, from phone calls from the spin doctors saying, of course you have to cover this story. Well, the answer I usually gave was, well, why? And often the reasons given were spurious. They would talk about balance, but they would try to bamboozle you as to having balance on exact coverage of each political party on a given day, when in fact you were able to do that over the length of a campaign and judge the stories on their merit. But that has sort of grew into the politician who would only answer one, give one answer, whatever the questions. Tony Blair was the, I remember interviewing him before he became party leader, asking several questions and 8 or 10 questions and got exactly the same answer to all 10. And that was the issue of getting your sort of your one message into the public domain. It was that sort of pressure on how to influence the media agenda, and that's become over the last 30 years an art form. The other big change, I think, is what I call the attention economy. That at the start of my career, you had writing journalists, you had photographers, and you had television, which was a rare occurrence on a story. It had to be probably a big story for a TV crew to turn up. Nowadays, everybody can be a video journalist with a mobile phone, but it puts immense pressure on journalists to be multi-skilled, as well as capturing the words. It's capturing the moment in photos or video. Again, that can lead to superficial coverage of stories because one person is trying to do so many tasks. And nowadays, with most media outlets, whether it's social media or online, for example, if there is no image, there's every likelihood the story will not sort of get the same coverage. The attention economy is the way of getting people's attention in a blizzard of media coverage. Again, during my career, for about 17 years, I worked for the Associated Press and ended up running, setting up and running their international video service. When that started in the early 90s, if you wanted to get live coverage from an event, it probably required 3 tons of equipment. By the time I left, it required a mobile phone, and that meant that no story, be it in the UK or around the world, was immune from coverage. And so, again, it was an added pressure. But I suppose the biggest pressure now on news outlets is the one that Chris referred to, which I've seen, is the fight for survival, particularly with newspapers, the fight for eyeballs and audiences, which mean that as the sort of the audience declines, the business model change, it puts more and more pressure, and news costs money. Quality news costs money. Some news organisations have got the message and still invest in news coverage. My contention is that a news organisation that doesn't invest in quality coverage really doesn't have a great future. That those who are smarter have adjusted their economics so that they still invest in high-profile investigative stories or getting the best coverage on a major story. But that financial pressure becomes ever greater, and that trickles down to the inevitably to the journalists. Fewer jobs, journalists not only covering more stories but doing more jobs within a newspaper. That multi-skilling is to the fore, and the same in broadcast. So the great change, as I say, the rise of the image, and particularly the moving image, with every journalist having to be a visual journalist as well as a writing journalist in this day and age, particularly if you're starting out in the profession. The growth of the spin doctor and the turmoil of the economics are really the three pressures that I've seen in my career.
Thank you, Nigel. إذا يعني يتحدث نايجل عن نوعين من الضغوط التي تطورت أثناء قيامه في هذه المهنة، ومنها إذا المسؤولين عن العلاقات العامة الذين يعني يحاولون تجميل صورة الحكومات، وهذه المهمة التي تسمى بالسبين دكتور التي بدأت مع بعهد مارغريت تاتشر. يقول أن الصحفيين الذين يعملون على القصص اليومية لم يشعروا بالضغط المباشر، ولكن المسؤولين عن البرامج أو الذين يقومون يعني مسؤولي الأخبار قد يتلقون اتصالات من هؤلاء الأشخاص يعني سؤالهم لماذا لم يقوموا بتغطية حدث معين أو نشاط معين لا سيما أثناء الانتخابات، وأنهم يعني رغم أن طريقة التغطية تكون على مدار الفترة بالكامل وليس بالضرورة في كل يوم أن يكون هناك تغطية لكل الأحزاب والنشاطات من أجل التوازن، ولكن كانوا يريدون أن تحصل هذه التغطية بشكل أكثر، ومنها كما كان يفعل على سبيل المثال توني بلير بالإجابة بنفس الطريقة ونفس نوع الأجوبة على كل الأسئلة، وذلك بمزيد من التأثير والإيصال هذه الفكرة المعينة. أما الضغط الآخر الذي تحدث عنه نايجل كان يتمثل بالجانب الاقتصادي وبنوعية التغطية وتزايد الضغوط الاقتصادية التي أدت إلى تحول الصحفيين إلى صحفيين متكاملين يقومون بأعمال مختلفة، وليس يعني في الماضي يقول أنهم عندما كانوا يريدون تغطية حدث ما عليهم الذهاب بفريق كامل متكامل ليضم المصورين ومجموعة من الناس لتغطية حدث، أما اليوم فصحافي واحد يمكنه أن يقوم بكل هذه الأعمال. I will, as it is a question and answer, I would encourage you now, if you have any questions to our panelists, to, yes, please. Yes,
first, thank you very much for a very valuable contribution and opinions. My first question to Chris, regarding the business model, as we heard and as we all know, there is a decline of print and there is the rise of digital. And it's very difficult to find the way as in a very changing media. So what would be, how you see the future of making sustainability in the digital media? And my second question before you answer to Zahra, how
Zahira.
Zahira, lightning, okay. How you see the pressure of the Jewish lobby in terms of coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in the British media? Thank you.
Shall I go first? I think it's a really difficult question. I think everybody is struggling to find out what the model is. Those that are most successful have created a subscription base, do charge for their services, create a subscription base, and they tend to do it around specialist content, so the Financial Times. It's much more difficult to create a sustainable model. There's a good example of one that's successful. It's much more difficult to create a model around commoditized news. But various people are trying to do it. I mean, obviously in this country we have the Times trying to do it via their paywall, the Telegraph Media Group trying to do it via their paywall. But I mean, if anyone sees the financial figures for the Telegraph for the last year, well, let's say the last 3 years. 3 years ago, the Telegraph, largely print focused. Well, it wasn't print focused, but its revenue was largely through its selling about 400,000 newspapers a day, was making £55 million a year. They reported their results 2 days ago. They've changed their focus towards digital. They reported their results 2 days ago. It's less than £1 million a year profit. So £55 million profit to £1 million profit in the process of transitioning to digital. And that's a huge threat to a 170-year-old newspaper. So they're confident that by building subscribers, by knowing who their readers are, by building a subscription base, that they can get through this extremely turbulent moment. £1 million profit down from 55 million in 3 years is extraordinary. They're confident they can get through it, but I think it's yet to be proved. Some American newspapers, New York Times, is doing very well off the back of a president who is, dealing them stories that their audience laps up every day. The Economist is doing all right. The FT is doing all right. The Times is supposedly doing okay. So there are models that work. The Guardian, which has a sort of voluntary subscription, I'm not sure that's. I don't think you're ever going to get people to volunteer to pay for commoditized news. That would be my view.
But they said they made it even this year.
Broke
Like,
even.
Yeah.
broke even.
But they have a £1 billion
They have a
endowment as well,
Yes.
so it makes it slightly
Yeah.
easier.
just 1 second. Just for translation.
بعد في سؤال ثاني.
يس بس خليني
إيه.
في ظل تطور الاعلام الرقمي اصبحت العديد من الصحف تعمل الى يعني تخصيص اشتراكات للحصول على المحتوى. هذه الاشتراكات يعني قد لا تكون موجوده على الصحف او المواقع التي تغطي الاخبار اليوميه والسياسيه، ولكن بالاختصاص، مثل اعطى مثال على الفاينانشال تايمز. ولكن كذلك هذا المثال يشير الى انه عندما كانت الفاينانشال تايمز توزع في اليوم الواحد نحو 400,000 عدد، كانت ارباحها تصل الى 55 مليون باوند في السنه. اما في اطار التحول الى الاشتراكات عبر الانترنت انخفض هذا الرقم الى 1,000,000 باوند فقط في السنه. فهذا يعتبر يعني مؤشر قد يعني يخيف بعض وسائل الاعلام، ولكن بعض الوسائل الاخرى مثل الايكونومست والنيويورك تايمز يعني يستطيعون انه يحافظوا على عدد جيد من المشتركين في هذا الاطار. ولكن هناك ايضا بعض الصحف مثل الجارديان التي اعطت الاشتراك الاختياري، ولكن يعني لا يعتقد ان قضيه اختيار الدفع قد تكون مربحه بالنسبه لهم. يعني لا اعتقد انه الناس سوف تختار ان تدفع وفي امكانها الحصول على محتوى مجاني.
Can I just say one thing? There's a unique, or not unique, but almost unique aspect of the British landscape, of course, which is the BBC, which people think is free or gives the appearance of being free, which of course it isn't because you pay license fees. But the BBC ostensibly makes news commoditized because it gives news to everybody for nothing. And that, of course, distorts hugely the commercial model for people wanting to sell news within the UK market. So it's a particularly difficult place to sell commoditized news.
ويعني بريطانيا لها خاصية معينة هي وجود البي بي سي، البي بي سي الذي يعتقد الكثيرون أن أخبارها مجانية، ولكن في الحقيقة أنها ليست كذلك، لأن كل مواطن يملك تلفاز يعني في منزله عليه أن يدفع رخصة تلفزيون سنوية، وبالتالي بالنهاية أنها ليست أخبار مجانية، ولكن بالشكل تبدو وكأنها أخبار مجانية وهي متاحة للجميع. فهذا يجعل المؤسسات التي تبغى الربح تواجه صعوبة أكثر بالاستفادة من بيع الأخبار أو جعلها مقابل يعني عرض المحتوى مقابل مادي. زاهرة.
First of all, we need to be talking about the Israeli lobby, not the Jewish lobby, because there's no Jewish lobby as such, but there is an Israeli lobby, and documentaries have been made on it, and one of them was done by Al Jazeera English, and that raised lots of complaints to Ofcom. But the good thing about this country is they have really independent regulator. So Al Jazeera English came out clean, and basically the result of the investigation into the documentary was that it did not actually breach the duly impartiality regulation. However, there was a very extensive study that was done by Glasgow Media Unit, and was published in 2 books. One was done in 2004, and then another one was done in 2011. And the first book was called Bad News from Israel, and then the second book was called More Bad News from Israel, where they added the coverage of the Gaza assaults in 2008, 2009. And in that book, they did interviews with journalists who actually are in direct contact, or they actually cover the conflict. And one of the things that the journalists were talking about is not the direct pressure, but the idea that they know that they need to be careful in their coverage because there will be a line of complaints coming if they say anything that might deem to be controversial or biased. And most of that, so they speak about Palestinian pressure to a certain extent, but the majority of that pressure comes from the Israeli lobby in the form of complaints. And the organization that gets most of those complaints are the BBC. And that was one of the issues that was, that BBC gets 250,000 complaints a year, while Ofcom, which regulates all the other broadcasters in the country, gets 25,000. So you could imagine people trust the BBC, and hence the level of complaints to the BBC becomes larger. But I can't claim the majority, but a big chunk of that 250,000 complaints is on the Middle East. And when we're talking about the Middle East, the majority of complaints in the coverage of the Middle East is directed towards the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I don't know if Wissam would like to share his own experience. No? Okay. You can talk to Wissam about this later, because he got one of those complaints when he was covering the Lebanon July war in 2006. So there were complaints against his coverage. But it's one of the things that journalists actually who are involved in the coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict complain about. And they tell you clearly that they are very careful in the language they use, in the amount of time they give to each party that is involved in the conflict, because they're afraid of, not because they're going to be, indicted at the end, or they will be found in breach of the editorial guidelines or the broadcast code. It's the process that they will have to go through till they reach the end result.
Okay. May I ask a question?
Yes, I will go straight to you. Just let me translate what she said.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. عندما نتحدث عن لا وجود لما يسمى باللوبي اليهودي، ولكن سنسميه اللوبي الإسرائيلي، لأن ذلك هو موجود، يعني يوجد لوبي إسرائيلي، وكان هناك عدد من الوثائقيات التي تحدثت عن هذا اللوبي والضغوط التي يعني يمارسها له بشكل غير مباشر. وتحدثت زاهرة أيضا عن الكتب التي صدرت عن الجلاسكو ميديا يونت بالعام 2004-2011، وهي أخبار سيئة من إسرائيل والمزيد من الأخبار السيئة من إسرائيل. وهذه الكتب تحدثت يعني بأكثريتها عن تغطية أحداث غزة والعدوان الإسرائيلي على غزة، وشملت مقابلات مع صحفيين يقومون بتغطية الأخبار في الشرق الأوسط. وما تحدث عنه الصحفيون أنهم لا يخضعون لضغط مباشر، ولكنهم يمارسون الرقابة الذاتية إن صح التعبير، لأنهم يعرفون أن هناك يعني إذا لم يفعلوا ذلك قد يكون بعض الشكاوى لأوفكوم حول تغطيتهم. هناك الكثير من الشكاوى التي تستقبلها أوفكوم سنويا، تستقبل حوالي 25,000 شكوى، ولكن البي بي سي تستقبل 250,000 شكوى. وهذا ربما لأن الكثير من المتابعين يثقون بأخبار البي بي سي ويريدون التعبير عما إذا يعني حسوا أن ما تنقله البي بي سي غير متوازن. وأكثرية هذه الشكاوى متعلقة بالشرق الأوسط، وطبيعي يعني بالعلاقات الإسرائيلية الفلسطينية، وماذا يعني كيفية تغطية هذه العلاقات. Yes, sorry.
ممكن شكرا. مرحبا، أنا اسمي هداني ديدمارز، أنا صحفية هون in London بس كندية لبنانية. And my Arabic is, I'm a student of Arabic, so I'll switch to English. I'm Hadani Marzam. Thank you so much for this, it's very interesting. I have been working as a journalist for over 2 decades, so I've seen the shift that you were talking about. And I haven't been to Oman, but I've written about your National Museum, which I will visit one day, inshallah. I write for the Middle East Institute and the New Arab here in London. And my question is actually referring back to what you said about this new news environment, where there's so much pressure on journalists, not only to be constantly producing and constantly regurgitating the news cycle, but also new threats to journalists because of the dreaded comments section and social media. And because I wrote a book on Iraq called Dancing in the No-Fly Zone, A Woman's Journey Through Iraq. It came out 11 years ago. I'm working on a new one, and I work a lot on gender and culture issues. And in Iraq, and in many places here in England, there have been threats against women journalists and activists and politicians. There have been assassinations here and in the Middle East. In Iraq, it's militias. Here, it's Joe Cox. I would be really interested to hear from a kind of gendered perspective how this new reality that we're living in this new journalism age, plays out in terms of threats against women journalists in the UK and in the Middle East.
I'll just mention Laura Kusenberg, who's the BBC's political editor, who is a brilliant journalist, right down the line, impartial, who attracts an amazing amount of vitriol from both sides. Particularly at the moment, there's a habit, sort of a practice of British journalists that you use Downing Street sources as a way of finding out what the government does. So a government spokesman tells a journalist something. They then quote Downing Street sources as saying something, and Laura puts these out on tweets. She's been putting these out on tweets, and in the past few weeks, she's been increasingly being accused of being a government mouthpiece because she is reporting directly, the government says this, and somehow it's being associated with her saying this, to the point that she now gets, as you say, I don't know if she's had death threats, but she's had significant threats. And you see around her, you see other journalists, normally rival journalists, springing to her defence, saying, don't have a go at Laura. So this discourse going on in the media at the moment is a very real one, and it is largely directed, or not largely, but a lot of it is directed at female journalists. And it's getting a lot of support within the industry, but I'm not sure there's much you can do about it, to be honest.
It's a reality, and it's not just a reality in the UK. So in the UK, there's another example. Cathy Newman, a presenter, Channel 4 news presenter, interviewed one of the far-right politicians, and his followers deemed that the interview to be biased, and that she actually grilled him more than they expected. Her to grill him, and she got death threats. But the thing that is there is that most of those threats comes in the form of sexual harassment. And mainly online sexual harassment. So it's happening in the UK. It's happening across Europe. We ran a conference at City on female journalists and writers, and there was a very high-profile panel in that conference from journalists from across Europe, and they were actually telling their own experiences of the kind of online harassment and online sexual harassment they get every time they publish something that is deemed by either a political party or a business or even a pressure group to be something that goes against what they prefer to be told about them. It's the good thing about it is that women journalists, female journalists are fighting back, and there are lots of colleagues that are male colleagues that are standing with them, and in most cases their organizations are supporting them. So it's not going to put them down. You know, they're going to keep doing what they're doing, but it's a reality, and social media has brought that reality in a very kind of negative way.
إذا باختصار just for the translation quickly. باختصار ما يقوله كريس هو عن مثال على لورا كوتنبرغ، وهي الصحفية يعني تتابع الشؤون السياسية في BBC، وهي تواجه انتقادات من الأطراف جميعا، ولكن في الفترة الأخيرة درجت عادة أن هناك يعني مصادر من الحكومة تقول للصحفيين معلومات معينة، وكانت لورا تنشر هذه المعلومات على سبيل التغريدات كتغريدات على تويتر، واتهمت بأنها يعني تسوق لسياسة الحكومة وتلقت تهديدات، لا يعرف إذا كانت تهديدات بالقتل، ولكن تعرضت لضغوط وتهديدات، ومعظمها طبعا كان على يعني وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي، ولكن كان هناك دعم من الصحفيين الآخرين الذين يحاولون يعني مواجهة من يوجه هذه التهديدات بالقول أن هذا لا يجب أن يحصل. أما زاهرة فتحدثت عن كاتي نيومان مذيعة شانل 4 التي أجرت مقابلة مع أحد قادة اليمين المتطرف، وكانت قاسية نوعا ما في مقابلتها من حيث الأسئلة الاستجوابية صح التعبير، وكان معظم أنصار اليمين المتطرف لم يرضوا عن هذه المقابلة ورأوا فيها تطرف أو رأي غير محايد، فكانوا يهددون، تلقت تهديدات بالقتل، ولكن أكثر التهديدات التي تلقتها لا سيما عبر وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي كانت على يعني بمثابة التحرشات الجنسية. وتقول زاهرة أن كان هناك مؤتمر لصحفيات من مختلف أوروبا تحدثوا فيه أنه عندما ينشر أي موضوع لا يعجب طرف ما، التهديدات تأتي على طريقة تحرشات جنسية من عبر وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي. ولكن الجانب الإيجابي يبقى أن هناك مواجهة لهذا النوع من التحرش والضغط، وهناك دعم من قبل الصحفيين من الجنس الآخر، وكذلك دعم من قبل المؤسسات التي تعمل فيها هؤلاء الصحفيات، يعني وهذا الدعم مستمر. Yes.
What's the prevailing, if there is a prevailing attitude amongst journalists as to whether or not anonymous identity should be removed in the social media world? So a lot of the harassment we're seeing is coming from cowards who hide behind that anonymous identity. Is there an attitude, is there an opinion on that, or do people still think that actually anonymous identity should be allowed in the internet space?
I think it's that my colleagues may know otherwise. It's not an issue that's sort of come greatly to the fore. I think obviously the government issued a white paper on regulation of the internet, and it's a great sort of hot potato as to how you regulate the internet. It's possible that that could be one issue that could be considered, but it's not something that has been sort of raised in journalistic circles to my knowledge.
Am I right in saying historically letters sent to journalists were always, if they were printed, your name and your address?
Yeah.
So there was no hiding behind.
Well, yes, obviously, traditionally, an editor might say name and address withheld, but they wouldn't print it without having the name and address. You're quite right. But I think that sort of the comments sections of particularly of newspapers are moderated to a degree, but as I say, I'm not aware of any discussion about taking out the anonymous quote. I think obviously if something is deeply offensive, libelous or whatever, a moderator would take them out, but they sail very, as I'm sure you've probably seen, they sail very close to the wind. Some of the comments are sort of humorous, some are barbed, but I'm not aware of any news organisation that's removed anonymous comments from the sort of comment sections of stories.
No, I mean, what they do is that they do choose
some stories not to have comments on at all.
Yes.
For
Yeah.
fear of you know, it being too incendiary. So they just say, on this story, we won't have comments.
And that happens particularly when they're legally contentious as
Yeah,
well.
but sometimes
Yeah.
equally in stories that tend to bring out a lot of
The worst in people.
the worst in people.
But if you're talking about social media posts, you know, journalists don't have control over that. It's the you know, it's the tech companies that actually control that, and it's one of the things that has been you know, talked about and discussed in the way to regulate the internet and to regulate social media, basically. But we're still at the beginning of it, so.
إذا السؤال عن التعليقات المجهولة لا سيما التي تتضمن تهديدات وأنه في الماضي كانت أي تعليق ينشر في صحيفة كان يأتي مزودا باسم المعلق وعنوانه وكان هذا يعني شرط من شروط النشر. أما اليوم فهناك تعليقات قد تكون مجهولة عبر الإنترنت ولكن مراقبة الإنترنت أمر معقد للغاية وبعض المنشورات في بعض الصفحات يمنع عنها التعليق إذا كانت مثيرة للجدل يعني لتفادي نوع من التعليقات المسيئة. أما التعليقات الأخرى يعني هناك نوع من الرقابة، مش الرقابة ولكن التنظيم. يعني إذا كان هناك بعض التعليقات التي تشمل كلمات نابية لا تنشر ولكن يبقى هناك تعليقات لأسماء مجهولة فلا يعرف من هو صاحب التعليق. أما زاهرة تطرقت إلى موضوع أن التعليقات على وسائل التواصل الاجتماعي وهي الأكثر لا يمكن للصحفيين أو للمؤسسات الإعلامية السيطرة عليها أو منعها حجبها، ولكن على شركات الإنترنت وشركات يعني حيث الوسائط التي تصدر عنها أو فيها هذه التعليقات هي من.
The only thing they can do is they can block the person who.
يعني فقط يمكنهم أن يمنعوا الشخص.
Thank you very much. I heard a lot of probably negative feelings from experts in journalism about the current status of journalism and the future. And probably, even though I have a little of gray hair, I'm still a young person, or at least I claim that, and I might represent the new generation. I was hoping to hear a little bit of optimism. And you talked about the half empty of the glass. And I wish you to talk about the other half. Now, compared to the past, like in the 80s and the 90s, which we lived and we were watching TVs and news outlets, the events worldwide were very little and there is paucity of news. Now you can't even blink your eyes. Now lots of events are happening here and there. Mr. Trump is tweeting and we all would like to see what is happening. So this richness of events and news is an opportunity for journalists and I hope you address that. Also there is this issue, or there is a new phenomenon of the freelancers, which probably wasn't there before. Now there are many of the even well-established organizations are contracting these freelancers, and they sacrifice their lives and they take all the threats, and they are so brave to bring the news for these organizations and for us. And that is an opportunity. The other opportunity probably is, it is easy today to edit and use. If, let's say, for example, if you tweet or you publish something, within seconds you can correct it. Previously, if it goes to if it was printed, now you wait for next day or probably for in next month if it was a magazine, for you to correct it. So, and many other opportunities. So I would like you also to please address, because the young people would like to hear something refreshing and supportive. And sorry for this comment.
So, are you optimistic?
We are very optimistic. Actually, you could tell that we're optimistic because we're talking about the negatives. No, we're not talking about the negative
I think it's the framing of the question that made because I completely agree with your point. I mean, if you look at the other side of the continuous deadline is that I don't have to wait 4 hours to get the news on television anymore. It's always there. That's really good. I worked in 24-hour news for 30 years. I think it's great. I think it will always be great. The framing of the question was the pressures it puts on the journalists. But the products, I think, are absolutely terrific, and they are world-class. They are world-class, truly world-class products that didn't exist 30 years ago. And so you're quite right for us to change that emphasis. But I think we were guided in that direction by the framing of the question.
هو السؤال هو الذي أدى يعني إلى هذا النظرة التشاؤمية التي تطرقت لها، لأنه احنا سألنا عن الضغوط التي يتعرض لها الصحفيون. ولكن يعني إذا تحدثنا عن الإيجابيات هناك الكثير من الإيجابيات، ويعني حتى الضغط إذا تحدثنا عن عامل من عوامل هذا الضغوط وهو عدم وجود أوقات محددة أو نشرات لها أوقات محددة لتسليم الخبر. هذا جانب إيجابي بحد ذاته، لأنه ليس عليه أن ينتظر ساعات من أجل نشر خبر معين، بل هناك أخبار على مدار الساعة. وهناك الكثير من الجوانب الإيجابية الأخرى، ولكن نحن يعني تطرقنا إلى الجانب ليس السلبي، ولكن نتحدث عن الضغط، وكان مقصود منه ربما الضغط السياسي الاقتصادي وغيره.
I'll just say, first of all, the gentleman is lucky to have any hair at all. But for every, you're quite right, for every potential negative, there are more positives. And something like the internet, for example, has disrupted, which is quite a big and traditional news industry in the UK. There are many places in the world where it's given people unique opportunities and is a great enabling force for people to communicate. So, and also the technology means that, as you say, the barriers to entry of being a journalist have come down, and you can communicate with people anywhere in the world. There are jobs now, of course, at the beginning of my career, if you reel off the titles of the jobs in media, nobody would have known what you were talking about. So there are immense opportunities, but it's, I think, particularly in the UK, it's going through a time of turmoil where the news industry is redefining itself, and nobody knows where really it's going to land in the long term.
يعني مع كل حديث عن السلبيات هناك الكثير من الإيجابيات، ولا سيما عصر الإنترنت والتطور في هذا المجال من حيث الحصول على إن كان على المصادر أو التوجه للناس من خلال الإنترنت يعني. وكذلك هناك العديد من الوظائف الجديدة في عالم الصحافة التي لم تكن موجودة من قبل، وهذا كله يعتبر من الجانب الإيجابي.
I think one of the positive things about us talking about the shortcomings of how journalism, the state of journalism now, is the fact we want it to be better. So we're heading towards the positive by actually talking about, the problems that we're facing. And if we don't actually identify the problems, we can't move forward. And I just want to make a comment on freelancing, on freelancers. So my role is to highlight the problems. And with freelancers, we're really struggling with organizations because they're now dropping staff journalists, which means it comes with insurance, coverage, live coverage, lots of privileges that comes with a staff journalist. The organizations is dropping all of that and sending freelance or commissioning freelancers where they're not responsible for any of the protection that usually comes with being a staff journalist. So that's something now, the Frontline Club, for instance, has introduced in London, which is an organization that have members, freelance war reporters across the world, they have established a register for freelancers. So they offer them insurance. Yeah? They offer them help. They offer them support when they are on the ground. They offer them the network where if they need to be evacuated, then there's someone they can call, they can contact in order to be evacuated. So the idea of freelancer, even though it looks like, yeah, everyone can do it now, it has its problems. And what we're working on now is trying to make sure that these journalists are safe and doing their job in a kind of like safe environment that makes them produce better journalism.
يعني بالإشارة إلى المواضيع السلبية الهدف منها هو أن التعلم منها والوصول إلى الأفضل في هذه المهنة، ولكن زاهرة تعتبر أنه مهمتها هي الإضاءة على الأمور على هذه الأمور السلبية. وبعض المشاكل يعني التي تواجهها مهنة الصحافة هي الذين يعملون بالقطعة أو فريلانسرز، فهؤلاء يعني تستغني المؤسسات الإعلامية عن موظفين دائمين للتهرب من التأمين الصحي ومن يعني الواجبات التي يؤمنها صاحب العمل. ولكن أقيمت مؤخرا حالة تنظيمية لهؤلاء الصحفيين من أجل إيجاد يعني تأمين صحي لهم وإيجاد من يرعى مصالحهم بالأخص في حالات الحروب من أجل سلامتهم. هناك من يتصلون فيه في حال يعني I know there is a lot of questions but I'm really sorry time is up. I know I myself I have enjoyed listening to our panelists and I hope you had enjoyed it as well, and I would like to welcome you again and thank you for coming, and I'm really sorry for those who couldn't take your questions.
I hope we'll now all have a chance to talk to each other while we enjoy a minute of light.